Welcome to Marvel Rivals Lore Read Aloud, a series where I read your favorite Marvel Rivals characters' lore so you don't have to. My name is CinderSlash, and today we're going to be going over Cloak and Dagger's hero story, A Brief Farewell. But before we take a stab at that, let's get into their basic lore page first. When teenage runaways Tandy Bowen and Tyrone Johnson were exposed to an experimental drug against their will, they unexpectedly gained extraordinary powers. Tandy generates piercing blades of pure healing light, while Ty can teleport himself and others through the Dark Force dimension. Together, they illuminate New York's deepest shadows as Cloak and Dagger. The time stream entanglement struck while Cloak and Dagger were traversing the Dark Force dimension. The pair emerged to find New York under the control of Dracula. They soon joined the heroic resistance fighting against the Empire of Eternal Night. And with that being said, let's jump straight into A Brief Farewell. The back alleys of New York had never been safe. When Tyrone Johnson and Tandy Bowen were just teenage runaways, they found themselves fighting to survive the cruel realities of living on the streets. When they gained their superpowers, becoming the crime-fighting duo known as Cloak and Dagger, they vowed to shed a little light and darkness on the most dangerous corners of the city so that no one else would have to live in fear again. But now, fear had taken over. Not just in the alleys, but across the entire island of Manhattan. Dracula, the Lord of Vampires, had come to town and somehow managed to lock the Big Apple in a state of eternal night. His blood-sucking minions were on a rampage, and there were only a few heroes left to protect the innocent citizens of New York City from being involuntarily drafted into the vampire army's ranks. "Watch out, Ty!" Dagger yelled. "On your left!" "I see him, Tandy," Cloak replied, turning to face 3 vampires that were rushing towards him, their teeth bared in a bloodthirsty frenzy. Cloak opened his billowing cape, revealing the pure darkness shrouded within. "Chew on this, boys!" Cloak said, as 3 ebony tendrils reached out from the void and ensnared the unsuspecting vamps. They struggled to break free, but to no avail. The vampires were pulled into the living portal to the Dark Force dimension. That was where Cloak's body should have been. As they disappeared into the pitch black, Cloak smiled, knowing what went in rarely came back out. "You let them off easy. Again," Dagger said, her voice echoing in Cloak's mind. "You do know that vampires thrive in the dark, right?" "Sorry," Cloak said, growing annoyed by Dagger's constant critiquing. "Fresh out of light. Maybe if you were here you could have finished them off like you do. But tonight's my night. Remember?" "Yeah," Dagger replied, with a deep sadness that Cloak could feel in his own soul. "How could I forget?" Cloak breathed a heavy sigh. His partner wasn't the only one who was struggling with their current status quo. Shortly before the creatures of the night had seized the city, Cloak and Dagger were on a routine mission busting some smugglers on the Lower East Side when the world turned upside down. Or more accurately, in their case, inside out. Normally, a few petty criminals would never have stood a chance against a pair of seasoned superheroes like Cloak and Dagger. But during the fight, something strange happened. A burst of light appeared in the sky, brighter than anything Dagger could have conjured up with her light force powers. As it washed over the city, Dagger instinctively leapt into Cloak's portal, and the two teleported away to safety, as they had done countless times before. Cloak reemerged shortly after, safe and sound. But when he opened the folds of his cape, Dagger didn't follow. Cloak feared that his partner had become lost in the Dark Force dimension, but those fears were quickly negated when he heard Tandy's voice in his head as clear as day. She was there with him, but at the same time, she wasn't. Cloak opened himself up again, straining with all of his might as he tried to summon Dagger's physical form through the portal within him. Suddenly, beams of pure light force erupted from Cloak's body. He let out an anguished scream, and where he had just stood, Dagger had taken his place. But now, Cloak was gone. And yet, he wasn't. If he had been thrust back into the Dark Force dimension, he could have easily navigated his way back out. But this was something entirely different. It was as if Cloak was looking at the world through Dagger's eyes. Baffled by what had happened to them, Dagger sought out the help of a trusted friend, Reed Richards, the brilliant scientist and superhero known as Mr. Fantastic. Reed told them that the bright light they had seen in the sky was caused by a massive disruption to the fabric of space and time itself, an event that he was calling the time stream entanglement. The cosmic disturbance had cascaded across multiple dimensions, leading to all sorts of unusual effects, such as causing some alternate realities to merge together into one. He surmised that since Cloak and Dagger happened to be traveling between dimensions together when the time stream entanglement struck their reality, they themselves had somehow become entangled with one another on a molecular level. Now, they seemed to exist in the same material space, and only one of them could occupy it at a given time. Curiously, even when one of them was physically absent, their consciousness remained fully present within the mind of the predominant partner. Reed ran a number of tests in hopes of finding a solution to the duo's dilemma, but nothing seemed to work. He promised the young heroes that he wouldn't give up, but for now, they would have to make the best of their new situation. Cloak mused that Dagger had always been the angel on his shoulder over the many years they had been partners. The fact that she was now quite literally a voice inside of his head and nothing more was going to take some time to get used to. Unfortunately, even more change was on the horizon than he had initially realized. When the vampires took control of Manhattan, the heroes tried to go about business as usual. At first, Dagger wanted nothing more than to use her light force energy to heal those who had been infected by Dracula's curse. Meanwhile, Cloak wasn't nearly as forgiving to the sinister creatures that had overrun his city. But as time went by, Dagger became more aggressive in her attacks against the vampires, while Cloak had a tendency to show more mercy to the poor people who had fallen under Dracula's sway. Their traditional roles were reversing, giving Cloak reason for concern. To make matters worse, there was a rift growing between their fellow heroes as well. Reed Richards was determined to cure the city of Dracula's curse with as little collateral damage as possible. He knew that many of the vampires stalking the streets had been innocent civilians when this all began, and he wanted to do whatever it took to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. But Tony Stark and his ally Moon Knight had learned of a more permanent means of removing the vampire threat in one fell swoop. Cloak could feel that Dagger was beginning to lean towards that more extreme option, and it scared him to see her once unwavering light beginning to flicker. "Tandy," Cloak said, finally working up the courage to confront his partner about her descent toward the darkness. "We've got to talk." "No," Dagger replied. "We've got to fight. We don't have time to worry about feelings, Ty. This is war. When are you going to finally man up and act like it?" Cloak paused, trying to keep his temper in check. He had known Tandy for so long, but it was almost as if he didn't know her at all anymore. Was this his fault, he wondered? Could her shift in demeanor have been caused by the prolonged exposure to the dark force energies that Cloak himself had barely learned to control, even after all these years? Dagger's light had always been the force that guided them, but what if it was finally snuffed out and he was to blame? Cloak's concerns would have to wait. He had just received a message from Reed Richards, asking him to come back to the Baxter building, which the heroes had been using as a stronghold since the vampiric invasion. In a blink, Cloak teleported away. Moments later, Dagger materialized in the Baxter building. During the teleportation process, Tandy had exerted her will in taking control of their shared physical form for herself. Cloak was less than thrilled, but he chose to remain silent and to observe. For now. "What's the deal, Reed?" Dagger asked, showing a touch of impatience. "You know we're way more help out on the streets than here in your lab, right?" "Indeed," Reed said. "You are needed on the front lines, but I think we both can agree that it would be better if there were two of you fighting this fight instead of just one." "What are you saying?" Dagger asked, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. "As you know, Tony and I have been designing technology that may be capable of repairing the time stream," Reed said. "This time stream reintegration device could undo the damage caused by the time stream entanglement and restore this reality, and countless others, to its original state. Do you think it could do the same thing for me and Cloak?" Dagger asked, jumping straight to the point. "In theory," Reed said. "The problem is, we haven't yet located an adequate source of chronovium to power the TRD, and a failed trial run could set us back months, a risk that Tony isn't willing to take. However," Reed stretched his elastic-like arm over his workbench, about 10 feet away. He grabbed hold of a small, high-tech device and retracted his limb back to its normal proportions. He held up the device for Dagger and Cloak to see. "This is a portable version of the TRD that I've been tinkering with," Reed continued. "It's not capable of realigning entire realities, but perhaps it could handle recalibrating something else that had become entangled. Something on a slightly smaller scale." "Tandy," Cloak said hesitantly within the mind of his partner. "I really don't want to be the guinea pig in another experiment. I think we should wait and—" "We're in," Dagger said, completely dismissing Cloak's concern. "Good," Reed said, placing a small shard of chronovium crystal into the handheld device. "Now stay very still and try not to scream too loud. Franklin and Valeria are sleeping upstairs." As the device activated, it bathed Tandy in a crackling cascade of energy. She grimaced in pain, feeling as though she was being ripped in half. And in essence, she was. The device was extracting Cloak's molecules from her own, in hopes of allowing both young heroes to live as separate beings for the first time in ages. When the energy faded, Dagger still remained, and Cloak stood by her side. "He did it!" Dagger exclaimed, wrapping her arms around her partner in glee. "Yeah, great," Cloak said, clearly less enthusiastic about the process. Part of it was because Dagger had gone against his direct wishes. But Cloak also had a deep fear that he would no longer be able to keep his partner's emerging darkness under check now that they were separated. Reed said, putting a hand on his chin as he studied the readings on his handheld TRD. "That's strange. What's wrong?" Dagger asked nervously. "It worked, didn't it?" "Mostly," Reed replied. "But even though you once again exist simultaneously within the same physical plane, it seems as though your energy signatures are still deeply intertwined." "What's that mean, big brain?" Cloak asked. "It means the change may not be permanent," Reed said, dismayed. If you were to activate the same conditions that triggered the molecular fusion, I'm afraid you're more than likely to revert into your shared state. So, no more teleporting then? Dagger asked. Works for me. But that's like my whole thing, Cloak replied. Not anymore, partner, she said. You can do lots of other stuff with your dark force, right? Get creative. I guess I can figure something out, Cloak said, uncertain. It looks like you're going to have to figure it out much sooner than anticipated, Reed interrupted. Ben just reported in from his transport mission and says he located a cluster of vampires attacking some citizens near Battery Park. No sweat. We'll be there in, Cloak started to say. But then he paused as Dagger shot him a dirty look. He realized they could no longer travel between locations in split seconds via the Dark Force dimension. Could we borrow a Fantasticar? Soon? Cloak and Dagger landed their borrowed vehicle onto the southern tip of Manhattan. The two heroes stepped off and began to scout the area for any sign of vampires. Now this is more like it, Dagger said. Just like the old days. Yeah, Cloak agreed. Except for that part. Dagger looked over at where Cloak was pointing to see a horde of vampires overtaking a ferry boat docked nearby. People must have been trying to use the ferry to get out of the city, Cloak said. And now they've got themselves trapped on board. Those vamps will eat them alive. We've got to help. Or, Dagger said, we could just hit the throttle, send the whole thing to Staten Island, and call it a night. Cloak looked over at Dagger in disbelief, uncertain whether his partner was joking or not. Either way, he wasn't amused. Instead of dignifying her comment with a response, he rushed towards the ferry to confront the vampires. Keep up, he called back to Dagger. She shook her head and followed Cloak into action. When they boarded the ferry, the pair kicked into full hero mode, picking off vampires with ease. Dagger manifested short blades of pure light force that she mercilessly thrust into the hearts of vampires. Cloak used his dark force tendrils to grab hold of their fanged foes and hurl them overboard. As Cloak and Dagger fought side by side once more, they both began to remember how much they missed their partnership, and perhaps how much they had taken it for granted. Just when they were starting to finally find their rhythm, though, they reached the ferry's control room and were met by a harsh reality. Inside, there were several human passengers, all huddled together. A group of vampires had them surrounded and looked ready to feast. I've got this, Dagger said, rushing towards the ship's bridge without hesitation. Careful, girl, Cloak said, grabbing a hold of Dagger's wrist for a moment, stopping her from leaving. You ask me? This looks like a trap. I didn't ask you, Ty, Dagger snapped back. And if you don't stop babying me, I won't ask you anything ever again. Now let me go. I've got people to save. Cloak released Dagger's wrist and watched his partner enter the control room. He wanted so badly to protect her, but she was her own hero. She had to make her own choices, for better or for worse. He let out a frustrated sigh and began to follow Dagger into the bridge. But before he could enter, the door that led into the room slammed shut, and a vampire locked it from within. Just as Cloak had feared, the vamps used the innocent passengers to lure the heroes in, and Dagger had taken the bait. There was no escape, no way out, except for one. I'm coming in, Tandy, Cloak yelled, the fabric of his cape beginning to ripple into an otherworldly breeze. No, don't do it, Dagger commanded. I can handle this. At first, it looked as though she was right. Tandy fought for her life, hurling her light daggers at the vampires with furious speed, but there were just too many of them. Cloak could only watch through the window in horror as his partner found herself outnumbered, exhausted, and cornered along with the terrified passengers on the bridge. You gave it your best, Cloak said, opening his cape and tapping into the full power of the Dark Force dimension. Now it's my turn. You can't, Dagger yelled, desperately pushing back another hungry vampire. Remember what Reed said! I don't care what Reed said, Cloak snapped back. All I care about is you. Well, if you teleport, you're gonna lose me, Dagger responded. And if I do nothing, I lose you too, Cloak said, knowing full well the gravity of the choice he was about to make. Still, Cloak teleported into the room, mere moments before the vampires could sink their teeth into Dagger's flesh. He quickly wrapped his arms around her as the fabric of his cape encircled the other passengers. In a blink, they were all gone. Moments later, Cloak reappeared at the Baxter building in a flash of darkness. With him, he brought a small group of relieved strangers who had been snatched from death's door at the last second. But even though the innocent civilians had been saved, someone else had been lost along the way. Cloak looked around frantically. His heart dropped as his worst fears were confirmed. Don't worry, Ty, Dagger's voice said inside of his head. I'm still here, whether I like it or not. I'd rather have you mad than dead, Cloak responded, trying not to show his joy that some part of Tandy had survived the encounter. Then you got what you wanted, Dagger sighed. After a long pause, she added, Thanks, I guess. I know the darkness has taken its toll on you, Cloak said, but I'm always going to be here to help lead you through it, just like you've always been there to guide me back to the light. That's why you and me are such a good team. We're more than that, Dagger said, her tone softening for the first time in ages. Ty wished he could look into her eyes and say what was really in his heart, but at the moment, just hearing her voice was enough. It would have to be. With that, his cloak folded in half on itself and he vanished from the Baxter building. He was headed back into the night, ready to take on the forces of darkness by himself, but never alone. And that brings part 1 of Cloak and Dagger's heroic story, A Brief Farewell, to a close. Once again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching these videos. I really hope you've been enjoying them, and I'll see you all in the next one.